Imagine standing in a crowded square, the morning mist still clinging to the earth, the air heavy with incense, and the low murmur of a restless crowd. At the center, tied to a rough wooden frame, is a man whose life is measured now not in years or days, but in the slow, deliberate slices of a knife. His eyes are open, his breath is shallow, his screams have not yet begun. This was Lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts. A punishment so horrifying that even in an age when beheadings, hangings, and torture were common, it stood out as a terror whispered about in fearful hush across the Chinese Empire. It was not a quick execution. It was not merciful. It was a performance of suffering, a ritual of power, and a spectacle of fear. Flesh was removed in small, precise pieces while the condemned remained alive. Each cut a promise that death would not come quickly, that every nerve would be forced to bear witness to the betrayal that had brought them here. Imagine the blade, small and sharp, slicing away a piece of your arm, then your chest, then your thigh, each wound weeping blood that drips onto the dirt below. Imagine the sting of open air on fresh wounds, the agony compounded by the knowledge that more is coming, that you will not be granted the mercy of a swift end. Each cut is a reminder your life is not yours anymore, your pain is not private, and your death will not be simple. They called it death by 1,000 cuts, but the number was less important than the message. This was a death designed to erase not just a body, but a soul, to mark a criminal as beyond redemption, a traitor so vile that even death itself would be denied until every shred of dignity was stripped away. Lingchi was used in Imperial China for crimes seen as the most severe treason, the murder of a parent, offenses that the emperor and the court believed threatened the cosmic balance of the empire. It was a punishment carried out in public, in marketplaces and execution grounds, where people gathered to watch, to learn, to fear. Because that was the purpose of Lingchi. It was terror in the name of justice, pain in the name of order, a spectacle in the name of power. And what makes it even more haunting is how long it lasted. Lingchi was practiced for centuries, surviving dynasties and wars, outlasting emperors and rebels, remaining a part of the empire's law until the early 20th century. Long after the rest of the world had moved past such brutal displays, in the final decades of the Qing dynasty, men were still being executed by 1,000 cuts while cameras clicked and foreigners looked on in horror. It was a death worse than death, a punishment so dark that it forces us to confront the question, how far will a society go to maintain fear, control, and order? Lingchi was not simply an execution. It was a ritual of unmaking, a carefully choreographed disassembly of the human body in the public square, designed to break a person down into nothing while preserving life just long enough for the condemned and the crowd to feel every moment of horror. At dawn, the condemned would be brought to the execution ground, often in chains, surrounded by guards and officials bearing the imperial edict that sealed their fate. The square would already be filled with people. Merchants pausing from their morning trade, mothers clutching children, who peeked through fingers, and elders who shook their heads as they muttered about justice and cosmic order. At the center stood the wooden frame, a rough cross or scaffold to which the prisoner would be bound with ropes that cut into flesh, forcing the body into an unnatural stillness. The executioner, often wearing a simple cloth headband, would step forward, sharpening his blades with deliberate slowness, the metallic rasp scraping against the dawn. The process was systematic. It would begin with the limbs. Small, shallow cuts at first, slices of flesh from the arms, the thighs, the calves. The condemned would feel every incision, nerves firing in agony, blood streaming down to stain the frame and the dirt below. The crowd would watch as flesh was peeled away in strips, the executioner working with a cold focus, never too quickly, never too deeply, ensuring the victim remained conscious, suspended in the space between life and death. Then, deeper cuts, muscle sliced, fat carved away, sometimes the breasts or pectoral muscles removed, the chest laid open, but not enough to strike the heart. The executioner would cut away parts of the torso, a grim, deliberate unmaking of the human form. At times, the face would not be spared, a symbolic stripping away of identity and dignity, a final humiliation for crimes seen as so severe they threatened the very fabric of the empire. Throughout this ordeal, the goal was to prolong life and suffering. In many cases, small doses of opium would be administered to the condemned, not as an act of mercy, but to prevent fainting and to keep the victim conscious as long as possible, ensuring the punishment was witnessed and felt in full. The executioner's skill lay in balancing pain and preservation, ensuring the condemned remained alive for dozens, sometimes hundreds, of cuts before the final stroke. Often a stab to the heart or a slash to the throat ended the torment. Lingchi was reserved for what the Imperial court defined as the heinous crimes: treason against the emperor, rebellion against the state, the murder of one's parents or masters. Offenses not just against law, but against cosmic order and Confucian values. In a society where filial piety was sacred and the emperor was the son of heaven, such crimes were seen as a tear in the moral fabric of the world, requiring a punishment that extended beyond death, that dismembered not just the body but the spirit. To the authorities, Lingchi was a message carved into flesh. No betrayal would go unanswered. No treason would be forgiven. No act of defiance would escape the gaze of the emperor. It was a spectacle meant to burn itself into the memory of every witness, to haunt the dreams of the people, ensuring obedience through fear. And so, for centuries, Lingchi persisted across dynasties, practiced in public squares across China. Each execution was a theater of power, a demonstration of authority that demanded silence from the condemned and compliance from the living. Because Lingchi was never just about ending a life. It was about sending a message that echoed across the empire, whispered in the streets, taught to children, and remembered by all who saw the red, soaked earth where the death by 1,000 cuts was performed under the indifferent gaze of the imperial banners. To truly understand why Lingchi was so feared, you must step into the mind of the empire that birthed it. A world where the body was not simply flesh and bone, but a sacred vessel, where death was not the end but a passage, and where how you died mattered just as much as how you lived. In Imperial China, the body was a gift from one's parents and ancestors, a trust to be kept whole in life and in death. The Confucian ideal of filial piety demanded that the body remain intact, for to damage it was to dishonor not only yourself, but your entire lineage. This was tied to beliefs about the afterlife. The spirit would carry the condition of the body into eternity, and an incomplete body meant an incomplete spirit, a restless soul wandering forever, unable to find peace. Lingchi was designed to be a punishment that extended beyond death. It was not enough to execute the condemned. The goal was to erase them, to destroy their dignity, to sever their connection to their ancestors, and deny them peace in the afterlife. Every slice of the blade was a cut, not only into flesh, but into the very soul of the condemned, ensuring that even in death, they would find no rest. This was why Lingchi was reserved for the most severe crimes: treason, rebellion, parricide. These were not just legal transgressions, they were spiritual desecrations that threatened the harmony of the empire. The emperor was the son of heaven, the pivot between earth and the divine, and any crime against him was a cosmic betrayal demanding a punishment that reflected its magnitude. To the authorities, Lingchi was the ultimate tool of deterrence. It was a punishment that struck fear not only into the condemned, but into all who witnessed it. The public nature of the execution was crucial. Crowds would gather in the market squares, watching as the executioner peeled away the flesh, hearing the screams, seeing the blood soak into the earth. Children would clutch their mothers, elders would shake their heads, and merchants would pause, reminded that rebellion and treason were not paths to glory, but to a slow, humiliating end. Lingchi was a spectacle of power, an assertion of imperial authority that reached into the hearts of the people, teaching obedience through terror. When we compare Lingchi to other brutal punishments in history, its unique horror becomes clear. In medieval Europe, there was drawing and quartering. A traitor's body ripped apart by horses after disembowelment, a spectacle of horror designed to display the consequences of betrayal. In Assyria, frying alive was a punishment for rebels. The skin of the condemned hung on city walls as a warning to others. The Persian Empire practiced scaphism, trapping a victim in boats and letting insects consume them slowly. Yet Lingchi stands apart, because it was not the quickest death, nor the messiest, but the most deliberate, the most systematic, the most ritualized destruction of the human form. It was an execution that was not just about killing, but about unmaking. A slow deconstruction of the body, slice by slice, each cut purposeful, each moment of pain drawn out to etch a message of fear into the minds of all who saw it. It was a punishment that turned the human body into a canvas upon which the empire painted its authority, using blood and agony as its brushstrokes. It is easy to dismiss Lingchi as the barbarism of a bygone era, but to do so is to miss the reality of the world that created it. This was a society where order was prized above all, where the emperor's word was divine, and where punishment was not merely retribution, but a sacred act designed to preserve the cosmic balance. Lingchi was a ritual of fear, a performance of punishment, and a reminder that in the world of Imperial China, power was absolute, and betrayal would not only cost you your life, but would strip you of your dignity, your peace, and your place in eternity. It is a dark chapter in human history, a testament to how justice can be twisted into horror when power and fear become the guiding principles of society. Lingchi was not an abstract terror whispered about in the dark corners of the empire. It was a very real, very public punishment, and its victims were often people whose names were known throughout China. Ministers, generals, rebels, and traitors whose rise to power ended with their bodies reduced to bleeding tatters in the marketplace. One of the most infamous cases was that of Lu Jin, a powerful eunuch in the Ming dynasty, whose influence at court was so vast that he was said to have controlled the emperor himself. Lu Jin rose from humble beginnings to become the head of the Eight Tigers, a group of eunuchs who effectively ruled the empire from behind silk screens and whispers in the palace corridors. He was ambitious, cunning, and ruthlessly efficient, accumulating vast wealth through corruption and alliances, silencing rivals with false accusations, and pulling the strings of power in a court that was already rotting from the inside. But in 1510, Lu Jin fell from grace, accused of plotting to overthrow the emperor, a crime of treason that cut to the heart of the cosmic order. He was sentenced to Lingchi. The execution took place over 3 agonizing days. He was tied to the execution frame in the public square of Beijing, his body displayed like a warning banner, and the process began. The executioner, skilled in the art of Lingchi, carefully sliced pieces of flesh from Lu Jin's body, starting with the limbs and working inward, ensuring that he remained alive for as long as possible. It is said that over 3,000 cuts were administered, though this number is likely an exaggeration, a dark embellishment to emphasize the extent of the punishment. Still, there is no doubt that the execution was slow, deliberate, and horrifying. The crowd did not merely watch, they participated, It was reported that pieces of Lu Jin's flesh were sold as trophies, purchased by those who believed consuming a fragment of the traitor's body would grant them protection from evil, or simply to hold as proof of witnessing the empire's wrath. Lu Jin's death was not just a punishment. It was a spectacle designed to obliterate his legacy, to transform him from the most powerful man in the empire to a cautionary tale, told in hushed tones to children who might dream of reaching too high. The Qing dynasty, which ruled China from 1644 until 1912, continued the use of Lingchi as a punishment for the most severe crimes, particularly treason and parricide. A man who killed his father or mother, violating the sacred bond of filial piety, was seen as a threat to the moral foundation of society itself. The empire believed such crimes were not just personal failings, but a direct assault on the cosmic order, deserving of a punishment that would extend beyond the grave. In one recorded case, a man who murdered his mother was sentenced to Lingchi in the 18th century. The execution was carried out in a busy market, where crowds gathered to watch as the man screamed, begging for mercy that would not come. His body slowly reduced to ribbons, while his family was forced to watch, witnessing the ultimate shame for their bloodline. Treason was treated with equal severity. Rebels captured after uprisings, whether peasant leaders demanding relief from crushing taxes or nobles challenging the emperor's authority, were tied to the execution frames. Their crimes proclaimed in loud voices as the crowd gathered, their screams mixing with the cries of hawkers selling food and trinkets nearby. A macabre contrast of daily life and state-sanctioned death. The empire used Lingchi to send a clear message. The emperor's will was unbreakable, and betrayal would be met with a punishment so severe that it would haunt the souls of those who witnessed it. As China began to open to foreign diplomats, missionaries, and traders in the 19th century, the practice of Lingchi shocked and horrified those who witnessed it firsthand. Missionaries from Europe and America, arriving with the zeal to convert and civilize, wrote home in disbelief, describing executions in vivid, often sensational detail. They described how the condemned would be tied to wooden friends in crowded squares, the executioners making precise cuts, and how the victim's screams would echo through the streets until, finally, the executioner would mercifully end the suffering with a final cut to the throat or a stab to the heart. These accounts found their way into newspapers and pamphlets back home, feeding the Western imagination with images of barbaric China and justifying colonial ambitions under the guise of moral duty. Perhaps the most chilling artifacts from this era are the photographs taken in the late 1800s. As photography advanced, some foreigners captured Lingchi on film, turning moments of unimaginable suffering into curiosities passed around in salons and academic societies. These grainy black and white images show bound men, their bodies stripped and bleeding, faces twisted in agony, surrounded by crowds who watch with expressions that range from horror to indifference. These images, stripped of context, became emblems of cruelty, used by foreign powers to paint China as backward, even as they ignored the brutal punishments practiced in their own histories. But even among the Chinese themselves, there were those who questioned the necessity of such cruelty. Reform-minded officials argued that Lingchi damaged China's reputation, that it was a relic of an older world, unfit for a modern nation facing foreign threats and internal decay. And so, as the Qing dynasty staggered toward its end, reforms were discussed, laws were reconsidered, and the empire slowly moved away from the spectacle of Lingchi. Yet Lingchi remains burned into history. It was a punishment designed to control through fear, to transform the condemned into living warnings, to remind the people that some crimes would not only end your life, but erase your body, your spirit, and your legacy. Each case, like that of Lu Jin, the eunuch who bled for days under the eyes of a hungry crowd, was a page in a dark chapter that shaped the fear and obedience of generations. It is a reminder that power, when left unchecked, can twist justice into horror, turning executions into public theatre, pain into performance, and death into a tool for control. And even now, centuries later, the ghosts of those died by 1,000 cuts remain in the pages of history, whispering of a time when the empire's wrath was measured not in words, but in blades, blood, and the slow, systematic destruction of the human body. They called it death by 1,000 cuts. But in truth, it was often closer to 100, maybe 300 cuts if the executioner was skilled, if the crowd was patient, if the empire's wrath needed to make a point that day. But let's be clear, even a single cut, done the right way, can feel like an eternity. Now multiply that by hundreds, with your body bound and exposed to the sun, the wind, and the eyes of hundreds, maybe thousands, who came to see your slow, brutal unmaking. It began with the frame, a rough wooden cross or scaffold, upright or sometimes leaning, just high enough to lift the condemned's feet from the dirt, forcing the legs to dangle, the arms tied so tightly that rope burned into flesh, cutting off circulation, adding numbness and swelling to the torment that was about to begin. The air was filled with incense, an attempt to mask the scent of sweat, fear, and later blood. Vendors moved among the crowd, selling tea, steamed buns, and candied fruits as people positioned themselves for a clear view. Some climbing onto carts and walls, children on their fathers' shoulders, because this was more than an execution. It was entertainment, a warning, a lesson. The executioner approached with quiet ritual. He carried blades, sometimes a small, razor-sharp knife for precise cuts, sometimes a longer blade for when the final moment came. His skill was paramount. A clumsy executioner could end the spectacle too, quickly turning the emperor's message into a brief gasp rather than a long, drawn-out scream that echoed through the minds of the spectators for days. He would test the blade on his thumb, checking for sharpness. Then he would look at the condemned, sometimes with indifference, sometimes with a cold, professional pity, but never with mercy. The first cuts were shallow, often on the chest or thighs, peeling away the flesh in small, deliberate strips. The goal was not to kill, not yet, but to begin the slow process of unraveling the body. Blood would flow in thin streams, bright red at first, turning darker as it dripped onto the dirt. The victim would scream, gasp, or moan, depending on their strength, their fear, and their acceptance of the inevitability of their fate. Sometimes, opium was given to dull the pain, just enough to prevent fainting, to keep the condemned awake, eyes wide, forced to watch their own body being taken apart piece by piece. Imagine this: you think your morning routine is painful. Try getting sliced open before coffee, before breakfast, before you've even had a chance to gather your thoughts for the day. And doing it again, and again, and again, while a crowd gathers to watch you die, not quickly, but slowly, methodically, with every nerve screaming, every breath a struggle. People came for many reasons. Some came to see justice done. Some came out of morbid curiosity. Some came because it was simply what you did when the empire announced an execution. There were those who jeered, shouting curses and insults at the condemned, while others wept, turning away when the screaming became too much. Children peeked from behind their mothers, their small hands clutching skirts, eyes wide, the image of the bleeding, screaming figure burned into their memories forever. After the initial cuts, the executioner would move on to larger pieces of flesh. The biceps, the calves, the pectorals. Muscle would be sliced away, exposing sinew and bone, the body trembling with pain and shock. The condemned would often slip in and out of consciousness, revived by splashes of cold water or slaps to the face. the executioner ensuring that they remained present for every cut. The face was sometimes cut, the nose removed, the cheeks sliced, turning the condemned into something unrecognizable even to themselves. It was a final humiliation, a symbolic erasure of identity. The process could last hours. If the crime was especially heinous, or if the emperor's message needed to be especially clear, the executioner would prolong the ordeal, making dozens, even hundreds of cuts before allowing death. The condemned might beg for mercy, cry out for family, or simply scream, the raw, animal sound of a human being in agony. The sound would echo through the marketplace, mixing with the sounds of daily life, a chilling reminder that the empire's justice was ever present. Eventually, when the executioner judged that the message had been sent, or when the victim's body could no longer endure, the final cut would be administered. A stab to the heart, a slash across the throat, or a final decapitating blow. The body would hang limp, blood pooling beneath, the crowd silent for a moment before the murmurs began again, people discussing what they had seen, what they had learned, and what they would whisper about to neighbors that evening. Lingchi was not about justice as we understand it today. It was about fear, control, and the assertion of power. It was about reminding the people that the emperor was the divine authority on earth. That betrayal would not only cost you your life, but would rip apart your body, your dignity, your very soul, piece by piece. It was a spectacle designed to terrify, to teach, to dominate. And for centuries it worked. It kept people obedient. It kept them silent. It kept them afraid. Because they knew, deep in their bones, that if they crossed the wrong line, if they betrayed the emperor, if they committed the wrong crime, they would end up on that frame, in the square, screaming as their body was carved away, a crowd watching, children crying, vendors hawking tea and buns as your life dripped into the dirt. And that was the horror of Lingchi. A death that was not just an end, but a warning, a spectacle, a ritual of terror that lived in the hearts of all who saw it, all who heard it, and all who remembered it for the rest of their lives. If you want to understand Lingchi, you cannot look at it only as a punishment. You must see it as a weapon, a blade the emperor held not just over the neck of a traitor, but over the entire empire. Because in Imperial China, the emperor was not just a man. He was the son of heaven, the divine intermediary between the cosmic forces above and the chaotic world below. His word was law, because it was believed to be the will of the heavens themselves, and maintaining order under his rule was seen as maintaining the balance of the universe. Lingchi became a political tool precisely because it was so terrifying. Executing a traitor or a rebel leader was not enough. The empire needed the punishment to echo, to ripple outwards, to sink into the minds of everyone who might one day think of defying imperial authority. It was a demonstration that the emperor's power was absolute. Not only could he end your life, but he could take your body apart, piece by piece, and leave you to die in agony while your family, your neighbors, and your community were forced to watch. Your death would not be quick or private. It would be slow, public, and humiliating. It would be a message to others that the emperor's justice was not something you could escape, not in life, not in death, not in the afterlife. Fear was the quiet enforcer of order. When peasants gathered around smoky fires in their villages, they would whisper about the man who was tied to the execution frame in the capital, the one who screamed for hours as he was cut to pieces because he dared to rise against the empire's crushing taxes. When a merchant thought about bribing an official or forging imperial seals to gain an advantage, he would remember the stories of the trader whose ambition led to the Lingchi frame, whose flesh was sold piece by piece as trophies in the marketplace. When a minor noble plotted rebellion, convinced that the emperor was weak. He would remember that rebellion meant not just defeat on the battlefield, but the slow, methodical stripping away of his dignity and flesh under the emperor's watchful gaze. Lingchi was the shadow in every dark corner, the unspoken threat behind every imperial decree. Confucian ideology prized harmony, hierarchy, and obedience. Society was seen as a series of relationships, say, ruler to subject, parent to and to wife. Each role came with expectations, and deviation from these roles threatened the stability of the entire system. Crime was not seen as merely a personal failing, but as a tear in the fabric of the cosmic and social order. Lingchi was reserved for crimes that struck at the heart of this order: treason, rebellion, parricide. It was used to mend the tear by demonstrating the consequences of defying your place in the hierarchy. In this way, Lingchi was not just punishment, it was a ritual of restoration, a brutal form of cosmic surgery, meant to excise the diseased element from society and reassert the divine harmony under the emperor's rule. And because it was public, it became part of the empire's collective consciousness, a lesson imprinted on every soul that witnessed it. Lingchi worked because it rarely needed to be used to be effective. Stories of the condemned echoed across the empire, from dusty village roads to the gilded halls of the imperial court. The terror of Lingchi did the emperor's work for him, enforcing obedience in the minds of the people before a single blade was ever drawn. Because what greater fear could there be than the knowledge that your rebellion would not only fail, but would end with your body carved apart, your soul denied rest, your family forced to witness your humiliation? What greater deterrent could there be than the image of your flesh falling to the ground piece by piece, while the empire continued around you, indifferent to your screams? Lingchi was fear made flesh. It was the emperor's whisper in the ear of every subject: obey, or you will be unmade. And for centuries, it worked. Lingchi did not end because it was too cruel for the empire's conscience. It ended because the world was changing, and China was being dragged, bleeding and gasping, into the modern age. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Qing dynasty was rotting from within, besieged by corruption, rebellion, and the relentless pressure of foreign powers carving away at its sovereignty. Missionaries, diplomats, and journalists brought stories and photographs of Lingchi back to Europe and America, where the images of men tied to wooden frames, flesh flayed from their bones, faces twisted in agony, became fuel for Western narratives of barbaric China. These stories were printed in newspapers, discussed in salons, and cited as justification for intervention, colonization, and the civilizing mission that European empires loved to proclaim. But foreign criticism was not the only pressure. Inside China, reform-minded officials and scholars saw Lingchi as an embarrassment, a relic of an older world that had no place in a modern nation struggling to build railroads, establish telegraph lines, and reform its armies to stand against foreign invaders. They argued that such brutal punishments damaged China's reputation, eroded the authority of the Qing in the eyes of its people, and demonstrated the empire's inability to adapt to a changing world. And so, in 1905, during the dying breaths of the Qing dynasty, Lingchi was formally abolished as part of sweeping legal reforms aimed at modernizing China's justice system. The empire sought to replace the spectacle of slow, public death with the cleaner, faster executions that characterized modern states. Firing squads and swift beheadings meant to preserve order without the theater of prolonged agony. But even as the law changed, the memory of Lingchi lingered. The last known executions by Lingchi occurred around the turn of the century, with reports of condemned men tied to the frame, the knife still cutting, the crowd still watching, even as telegraph poles rose in the distance and foreign soldiers marched through treaty ports. Lingchi's abolition did not erase the fear it had etched into the soul of China. It remained a ghost in the collective memory, a reminder of the power the empire once wielded, of the cruelty it was willing to inflict to maintain order, and of the brutal spectacle that for centuries had kept the people obedient under the shadow of the dragon throne. In the end, it was not morality that killed Lingchi, but the slow, grinding gears of history, modernization, and the collapse of an empire that could no longer afford to rule through blood and fear alone. Yet its legacy remains, a dark reminder that the line between justice and horror is often drawn not by mercy, but by the shifting tides of power and the relentless march of time. Lingchi did not vanish from the world with the stroke of a pen in 1905. Instead, it seeped into memory, myth, and fear, becoming something larger than a method of execution, becoming a symbol of absolute power, of betrayal's ultimate price, and of the darkness that can live quietly within the structures of law. In the West, Lingchi entered the imagination as the ultimate cruelty. Missionaries and diplomats who witnessed it firsthand returned home with stories of men cut to pieces in dusty marketplaces, their screams mingling with the cries of street hawkers, the smell of blood heavy in the air as the executioner's knife worked with slow precision. Photographs smuggled back to Europe and America, grainy and stark, showed bodies bound and butchered, faces twisted in agony, limbs sliced away, turning these moments of unimaginable suffering into dark curiosities in salons, lectures, and newspapers. To the Western world eager to paint China as barbaric, Lingchi became a convenient emblem, a gruesome proof of the so-called savagery of a civilization they could neither fully understand nor control. But in China, Lingchi's legacy was more intimate, more haunting. It became a cautionary tale whispered in villages and towns. Do not betray your family. Do not defy the emperor. Do not imagine yourself above the order of the world, lest you end up on the frame, your flesh cut away while your family weeps, your ancestors dishonored, your spirit doomed to wander incomplete forever. Parents invoked it to frighten children into obedience. Officials evoked its memory to remind communities of the state's power. Even after its abolition, the memory of Lingchi remained, an unspoken fear beneath the surface of society, reminding people of what could happen when the thin line of loyalty was crossed. Because Lingchi was not merely a punishment, it was a performance. Each cut, each scream, each drop of blood was a message written in flesh and fear. It was the empire's assertion that some betrayals demanded a punishment so severe, so slow, that it became a living horror. A death that would teach others not to follow the same path. What does a society learn when punishment becomes performance? Perhaps it learns to fear power more deeply. Perhaps it learns that justice, once entangled with fear and spectacle, becomes a tool of control rather than a measure of fairness. Perhaps it learns that the line between justice and cruelty can disappear when punishment ceases to be about the crime and becomes about the lesson taught to the living. Lingchi's legacy forces us to confront the darkness that can hide behind the language of justice, order, and loyalty. It challenges us to look at our own societies and ask where fear and spectacle still shape how we punish, how we judge, and how we remember. 1,000 cuts for a single crime, a slow death for a fast betrayal. This was Lingchi, a reminder that human beings have always been capable of turning punishment into ritual, justice into horror, and death into a spectacle meant to teach the living how to obey. Because history is not always noble, nor is it always kind. Often it is dark, soaked in blood and sharpened on the blade of power, and we must remember it. History is dark, and we must remember it.